Chapter 31, The Politics of Boom and Bust. Chapter Introduction. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. We have not yet reached the goal, but we shall soon, with the help of God, being set a day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Herbert Hoover, 1928. Three Republican presidents, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, steered the nation on a roller coaster ride in the 1920s, a thrilling ascent from the depths of post-World War I recession to breathtaking heights of prosperity, followed by a terrifying crash into the Great Depression. In a retreat from progressive reform, Republicans sought to serve the public good less by direct government action, and more through cooperation with big business. Some corrupt officials served themselves as well, exploiting public resources for personal profit. Meanwhile, the United States retreated from its brief international fling during World War I and resumed with vengeance its traditional foreign policy of military unpreparedness and political isolationism. So what you want to understand here is this paragraph in introduction is kind of just discussing how you're getting three Republican presidents that are kind of having to deal with the issues of post-World War I. You're looking at policies that are looking at less direct government, right? And of course, that tend to favor some of those big businesses as well. The Republican old guard returns. We need to look here at Harding's strengths and weaknesses, and also how did the Atkins v. Children's Hospital ruling go against Mueller v. Oregon, and in what ways did corporations and big industrialists thrive under Harding. The Republican old guard returns. Warren G. Harding, inaugurated in 1921, looked presidential with a erect figure. Big, broad shoulders, high forehead, bushy eyebrows, and gray hair. He was one of the most liked men of his generation. An easygoing, warm-handed backslapper, he exuded graciousness and love of people. So kindly was his nature that he would brush off ants rather than crush them. Like the charming, smiling exterior concealed a weak, inept interior. With a mediocre mind, Harding quickly found himself beyond his depth in the presidency. God, what a job, was his anguished cry on one occasion. Harding, like Grant, was unable to detect moral halitosis in associates, and he was soon surrounded by his poker-playing, shirt-sleeve cronies of the Ohio gang. Harding was one of the boys. He hated to hurt people's feelings, especially those of his friends, by saying no, and designing political leeches capitalized on his weakness. The difference between George Washington and Warren Harding, ran a current quip, was that while Washington could not tell a lie, Harding could not tell a liar. He was not a bad man, said one Washington observer. He was just a slob. So one of the issues that Warren G. Harding had, of course, had to deal with was just the corruption that was around him. That's important that you want to understand. And he's a good man, however, he could not read bad people. So I would make sure you throw that as a weakness. Candidate Harding, who admitted his scanty mental furnishings, had promised to gather about him the best minds of the party. Charles Evan Hughes, masterful, imperious, incisive, brilliant, brought to the position as Secretary of State, dominating if somewhat conservative leadership. The new Secretary of the Treasury was lean and elderly aluminum king Andrew W. Mellon, multi-millionaire collector of the paintings that are now displayed in Washington as his gift to the nation. Chubby-faced Herbert Hoover, famed feeder of the Belgians and wartime food administrator, became Secretary of Commerce. An energetic businessman and engineer, he raised his second-rate cabinet post to first-rate importance, especially in the drumming up of foreign trade for U.S. manufacturers. But the best minds of the cabinet were largely offset by two of the worst. Senator Albert B. Bell of New Mexico, a scheming anti-conservative, was appointed Secretary of the Interior. As guardian of the nation's natural resources, he resembled the wolf hired to protect the sheep. Harry M. Daugherty, a small-town lawyer, but a big-time crook in the Ohio gang, was supposed to prosecute wrongdoers as Attorney General. So a couple things that we want to understand here. Looking at his administration, there are pros and there's cons. The cons that you want to make sure that you understand is, of course, you have the hiring of Albert B. Fall, who is an anti-conservationist, right? So he's all for the use of natural resources to benefit the economy. And you're also getting Harry M. Daugherty. He's a small-time lawyer, but a big-time crook in the Ohio gang. So he was supposed to prosecute people for wrong, but obviously he's not doing that, which we'll get into more detail on. Some of the good things that you want to make sure you understand is that the hiring of Herbert Hoover. I mean, you want to mention that these three men, I mean, they were very beneficial to his administration. GOP reaction to the throttle. Well-intentioned but weak-willed, Harding was a perfect front for enterprising industrialists. A McKinley-style old order settled back into place with heavy thud at war's end, crushing reform seedlings that had sprouted in the progressive area. A nest-feathering crowd moved into Washington and proceeded to hoodwink Harding, who many regarded as an unviable boob. The new old guard hoped to improve on the old business doctrine of laissez-faire. Their plea was not simply for government to keep its hands off of business, but for government to help business along path to profits. They subtly and effectively achieved their ends by putting the courts and administrative bureaus into the safekeeping of fellow stand-platters for the duration of a decade. The Supreme Court was a striking example of this trend. Harding lived less than 3 years as president, but he appointed 4 of the 9 justices. Several of his choices were or became deep-dyed reactionaries, and they buttressed the dike against popular currents for nearly 2 decades. Harding's fortunate choice of Chief Justice was ex-President Taft, who not only performed his duties ably, but surprisingly was more liberal than some of his cautious associates. So, all in all, what these 3 paragraphs are saying is he's a little bit different from the progressives that you've gotten in the last 10 to 15 years. He's kind of pushing back to have the Roaring 20s be a time of more laissez-faire style government, right? When businesses are able to thrive and make profits and do what they want. And he's doing this through the Supreme Court. Remember, in that 3rd paragraph we just read, that he's appointed 4 of the 9 justices. So that's going to have a lot of influence. So I'll throw that as a weakness. He's more laissez-faire. I mean, he's letting big business thrive. He's letting them do what they want. I mean, if you wanted to put that as a pro, you could. But just keep in mind the effects. In the first 20 years of the 1920s, the Supreme Court axed progressive legislation. It killed a federal child labor law, stripped away many of labor's hard-won gains, and rigidly restricted intervention in the economy. In the landmark case of Adkins v. Children's Hospital, the court reversed its own reasoning in Mueller v. Oregon, which had declared women to be deserving of special protection in the workplace and invalidated a minimum law wage for women. Its strained ruling was that because women now had the right to vote, they were the legal equals of men and can no longer be protected by special legislation. The contradictory premise of Mueller and Adkin cases formed a debate over gender differences that would continue for the rest of the century. Were women sufficiently different from men that they merited special legal and social treatment, or were they effectively equal in the eyes of the law and therefore undeserving of special protections and preferences? So a couple things. I mean, remember we're getting a very conservative Supreme Court. One of the things that they do is they reverse the case of Mueller v. Oregon that provided special protections for women in the workforce. Right. When you get a chance, go to see the Progressive Women section, which is right here, right, in chapter 28.5, and I'll definitely go through that. So under his administration, that you're seeing a lot of progressive reforms, such as child labor laws, that are going backwards. Government for sale. So this is a political cartoon that we will discuss in class. Okay. Corporations under Harding could once more relax and expand. Antitrust laws were often ignored, circumvented, or feebly enforced by friendly prosecutors in the Attorney General's office. The Interstate Commerce Commission, to single out one agency, came to be dominated by men who were personally sympathetic to the managers of the railroads. Harding's reaction is might as well boosted. We care not what we we care not what the laws the Democrats pass along, as we are permitted to administer them. So even when you are getting the Interstate Commerce Commission, there are the people that are put in place. They're not concerned so much in terms of putting in place the things that the progressives did prior. Big industrials striving to remove the rigors of competition now had a free hand to set up trade associations. Cement manufacturers, for example, would use these agencies to agree upon standardization of products, publicity campaigns, and a united front in dealing with the railroads and labor. Although many of these associations ran counter to the spirit of existing antitrust legislation, the formation was encouraged by Secretary Hoover. His sense of engineering efficiency led him to condemn the waste of resulting from cutthroat competition, and his commitment to voluntary cooperation led him to urge big business to regulate themselves rather than be regulated by big government. So we definitely went ahead and we addressed a lot of the strengths and weaknesses of the Harding administration. Some of the strengths that you could bring up is Herbert Hoover, specifically in that last paragraph that we brought up. Although these trade associations that were set up, for example, the Cement Manufacturers Trade Association, was beneficial because it set standardization, and also it did set up standardization as well and set up requirements for certain aspects of production. That was good because it allowed businesses to kind of regulate themselves rather than big government. So there was a little bit more organizations and structure. However, you want to understand that a lot of the cons that existed, of course, were corruption, more laissez-faire policies, child labor laws were now being revoked, protection against women were being revoked in the workforce. Adkins v. Children's Hospital would definitely be a weakness. I went over number 2, and I believe that kind of assessing those weaknesses, in what ways the corporations, big industrialists, benefit under Harding. You're getting things such as the ICC, although it's present, they're not really keeping a watchful eye industrialists and big businesses, which allow them to expand. The aftermath of the war. Questions that we want to look at here: in what ways did the American Legion benefit veterans? The wartime government controls on the economy were swiftly dismantled. The War Industries Board disappeared with almost indecent haste. With its passing, progressive hopes for more government regulation of big business evaporated. Washington likewise returned the railroads to private management in 1920. Reformers had hoped that the wartime government operation of the lines led to the permanent nationalization. Instead, Congress passed the Ash-Cummins Transportation Act of 1920, which encouraged private consolidation of the railroads and pledged the ICC to guarantee their profitability. The new philosophy was not to save the country from railroads, as in days of the populace, but to save the railroads for the country. First 2 paragraphs, we're getting a lot of the policies of the wartime, such as the War Industries Board are disappearing, and there's hope to bring privatization back to a lot of aspects of American life, such as the railroads. The federal government also tried to pull up anchor and get out of the shipping business. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920 authorized a shipping board, which controlled about 1,500 vessels to dispose of much of the hastily built wartime fleet at bargain basement prices. The board operated the remaining vessels without conspicuous success. Under the La Follette Seamen's Act of 1915, American shipping could not thrive in competition with foreigners, who all too often provide their crews with wretched food and starvation wages. Labor, suddenly deprived of its wartime crutch of friendly government support, limped along badly in the post-war decade. A bloody strike in the steel industry was ruthlessly broken in 1919, partly by exploiting ethnic and racial divisions among steel workers, and partly by branding the strikers as dangerous Reds. The Railway Labor Board, a successor body to the wartime labor boards, ordered a wage cut of 12% in 1922, provoking a 2-month strike. It ended when Attorney General Daughtry, who fully shared Harding's big business bias, clamped on the strikers, one of the most sweeping injunctions in American history. Unions wilted in this hostile political environment, and membership shriveled by nearly 30% between 1920 and 1930. So You're getting the weakness of the labor union. Remember, Harding is very pro-business, and you're getting these strikes that are broken up as a result of that. And you're getting wages that are decreasing. And a lot of this is also because of the Red Scare. So keep that in mind. Needy veterans were among the few non-business groups to reap lasting gains from the war. Congress in 1921 generously created the Veterans Bureau, authorized to operate hospitals and provide vocational rehabilitation for the disabled. So, as you can hear, my dogs are favoring Harding's policy on veterans, right? Because during this time, the veterans were given support. They were one of the few groups that were actually given welfare. Veterans quickly organized into pressure groups. The American Legion had been founded in Paris in 1919 by Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Legionnaires met periodically to renew old hardships. Legionnaires met periodically to renew old hardships and let off steam and good-natured horseplay. The Legion soon became distinguished for its militant patriotism, rock-ribbed conservatism, and zealous anti-radicalism. The Legion also became notorious for its aggressive lobbying for veteran benefits. The chief grievance of the former doughboys was monetary. They wanted their dough. The former servicemen demanded adjusted compensation to make up for the wages they had lost when they turned in their factory overalls for military uniforms during the Great War. So the Legion was also very important because it advocated for money for a lot of the veterans. Critics denounced that the demand as a hold-up bonus, but with the millions of veterans deployed heavy political artillery. They browbeat Congress into passing a bonus bill in 1922, which Harding promptly vetoed. Reforming their lines, the repulsed veterans gathered for a final attack. In 1924, Congress again hoisted a white flag and passed the Adjusted Compensation Act. It gave every former soldier a paid-up insurance policy due in 20 years, adding to about $3 billion to total cost of the war. Penny-pitching Calvin Coolidge sternly vetoed the measure, but Congress overrode him, leaving the veterans with their loot. So one of the things that you could also add for strengths of the Harding presidency is he does go ahead and help the veterans in World War I, providing them more welfare. Some of the weaknesses that you could put down is, of course, and it's up to you how you want to put this as a strength or weakness, is labor unions were losing a lot of their support. In what ways did the American Legion benefit veterans? They were able to get them compensation for wages lost during the war. America seeks benefits without burdens. Making peace within the fallen foe was the most pressing problems left on Harding's doorstep. The United States, having rejected the Treaty of Versailles, was still technically at war with Germany, Austria, and Hungary nearly 3 years after the armistice. Peace was finally achieved by lone wolf tactics. In July 1921, Congress passed a simple joint resolution that declared the war officially ended. Isolation was enthroned in Washington. The Harding administration, with the Senate irreconcilables holding a hatchet over its head, continued to regard the League of Nations as a thing unclean. Harding at first refused even to support the League's World Health Program, but the new world body was too important to be completely ignored. Unofficial observers were sent to its seat in Geneva, Switzerland, to hang around like detectives, shadowing a suspected criminal. So, of course, the war ends, peace is declared. Remember, the United States is not part of the League of Nations. However, we're still sending individuals to monitor what is going on. Of course, you want to make sure you understand this cartoon. We'll discuss it in class. Harding could not completely turn his back on the outside world, especially the Middle East, where a sharp rivalry between America and Britain for oil drilling concessions. Remembering the Allies had floated to victory on flood of oil, experts recognized that liquid black gold would be as necessary as blood in the battles of tomorrow. Secretary Hughes eventually secured for American oil companies the right to share in the exploitation of sandy regions' oil riches. Disarmament was one international issue on which Harding, after much indecision, finally seized the initiative. He was prodded by business people unwilling to dig deeper into their pockets for money to finance the ambitious naval programs starting during the war. A deadly contest was shaping up with Britain and Japan, which watched with alarm as oceans filled with American vessels. Britain still commanded the world's largest navy, but the clatter of American riveters proclaimed the United States would soon overtake it. Public agitation in America, fed by these worries, brought about the headline making Washington Disarmament Conference in 1921-1922. Invitation went to all major naval powers except Bolshevik Russia, whose government the United States refused to officially recognize. The double agenda included naval disarmament and the situation in the Far East. At the outset, Secretary Hughes startled the delegates who were expecting the usual diplomatic fence straddling with a comprehensive concrete plan for a 10-year holiday on the construction of battleships, and even for scrapping some of the huge dreadnoughts already built. He proposed the scaled-down navies that America and Britain should enjoy, parity in battleships and aircraft carriers, with Japan on the small end of a 5-5-3 ratio. This arrangement sounded to the sensitive Japanese ambassador like Rolls-Royce, Ford. So you need to know this disarmament conference in 1921, 1922. America is really looking to lower the amount of armaments they have, as well as making sure that the other world powers are disarming as well. Of course, Japan is not happy with this. As you can see, the statement here, 5-5-3. That's the ratio at which that they could create their navy as well as their aircrafts, and they're not happy with this because they feel that the United States and Great Britain's military are more like Rolls-Royce, while on the other hand, Japan is still a Ford, right? I mean, the luxury isn't there, the quality isn't there. Complex bargaining followed in the wake of Hughes' proposals. The five-power naval treaty of 1922 embodied Hughes' ideas on the ship ratios, but only after saving compensation was offered to insecure Japanese. The British and Americans both conceded that they would refrain from fortifying their far eastern possessions, including the Philippines. The Japanese were not subjected to such restraints in their possessions. In addition, the four-power treaty replaced a 20-year-old Anglo-Japanese alliance. The new pact bound Britain, France, and Japan and the United States to preserve the status quo in the Pacific, under a concession to the jumpy Japanese. Finally, the Washington Conference gave chaotic China, the sick man in the Far East, a shot in the arm with the nine-power treaty of 1922, whose signatories agreed to nail wide open door in China. So all in all, what you need to make sure you know is this nine-power treaty. It's looking at disarmament with Great Britain, France, United States, China. All the powers that are listed there. But also, the one thing you understand is the most important part is of this nine-power treaty is that ensuring that China still has an open door policy, right? It also says that the United States and the Great Britain they're not going to go ahead and build up their military in the Pacific to insecure stability. That's in some ways to ensure that Japan is happy about it, right? So going back here, in what ways did discuss the purpose and the outcome of disarmament conference in 1921-92. The purpose is to just to have disarmament of the Navy as well as the aircraft during this time, this non-war time, right? The outcome is, of course, Japan isn't necessarily happy with the restrictions in the Army and the Navy. However, they do agree to it, and the outcome leads to an open door policy in China that must be secured. You're looking at disarmament of military, and more specifically, once again, warships and also aircraft carriers. And you're also looking at the United States saying that they're not going to build more of their military in the Pacific, right? So what you want to make sure is that you are kind of just discussing those elements here, right? Which I just brought up. When the final gavel banged, the hardened knights boasted with much fanfare, and some justification of their globe-shaking achievement and disarmament. But their satisfaction was somewhat illusory. No restrictions had been placed on small warships, and other powers churned ahead with constructions of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, while penny pitching Uncle Sam lagged dangerously behind. Congress also pointedly declared that it was making no commitment to the use of armed force or any kind of joint action when it ratified the Four Power Treaty. These reservations, in effect, rendered the treaty a dead letter. Ominously, the American people seemed content to rely on their security on words and wishful thinking rather than on weapons of hard-headed. So that paragraph is very important to understand, is because there's a lot of loopholes within this. So, for example, um, the treaty fails to mention smaller warships, right? Or didn't mention anything about cruisers, destroyers, submarines. Those things could still be built. Um, so this is in some ways leading our military to fall behind. A similar sentimentalism welled up later in the decade when Americans clamored for the outlawry of war. The conviction spread that if quarreling nations would only take the pledge to forswear war as an instrument of national policy, swords could be beaten into plowshares. Um, Calvin Coolidge, Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg, who later won a Nobel Peace Prize for his role, was lukewarm about the idea. But after petitions bearing more than 2 million signatures cascaded in Washington, he signed with the French Foreign Minister in 1928 the famed Kellogg-Briand Act, officially known as the Pact of Paris. It was ultimately ratified by 62 nations. This new parchment peace was illusory and extreme. Defensive wars were still permitted, and what scheming aggressors could not cook up as an excuse for self-defense. Lacking both muscle and teeth, the pact was a diplomatic derelict and virtually useless in a showdown. Yet, it accurately and dangerously reflected the American mind in the 1920s, which was all too willing to be lulled into a false sense of security. This mood took even deeper hold in the ostrich-like neutralism of the 1930s. So what this act is basically saying is, I don't like the way that your book defines this. They're a little bit vague with it. Um, in short, what it's saying here is, um, sorry, that this act, also called the Pact of Paris, is a multilateral agreement that says that war should not be an instrument of national policy. That you're getting various nations are signing and saying that they're going to use more diplomacy rather than war, right? Um, yeah. So as a result of Kellogg's proposal, nearly all the nations of the world eventually subscribed to the Kellogg-Briand Act, agreeing to renounce war as an instrument of national policies. Right. These signatories allowed themselves a great variety of qualification interpretations, however, so the pact would not prohibit, for example, wars of self-defense. So it's too vague when you're looking at this. When in terms of it's very idealistic, saying, "Hey, we're not going to go to war." However, uh, we need to define what war is, but also what qualifies as self-defense. Hiking the tariff higher. Um, yep. So make sure you're able to understand what issues still existed after the disarmament conference. There's at least three issues which we discussed. Um, and then also think about the significance of the Kellogg-Briand Act. I mean, basically, it just said that war would be the last instrument of diplomacy to ever be used, right? It shouldn't be used. Hiking the tariff higher. A comparable lack of realism affected foreign economic policy in the 1920s. Business people, short-sightedly obsessed with dazzling prospects in their prosperous home market, sought to keep the market to themselves by flinging up the insurmountable tariff walls around the United States. They were spurred into action by their fear of flood of cheap goods from recovering Europe, especially during the brief but sharp recession of 1920 and 1921. In 1922, Congress passed the comprehensive Mccomber Tariff Law. Glib lobbyists once more descended upon Washington and helped boost schedules for the average of 27% under Wilson's Underwood tariff of 1913 to an average of 38.5%, which was almost as high as Taft's Payne-Aldrich tariff of 1909. Duties on farm produce were increased, and the principle was proclaimed that the general rates were designed to equalize the costs of American foreign production. A promising degree of flexibility was introduced for the first time when the president was authorized, with the advice of the fact-finding tariff commission, to reduce or increase duties by as much as 50%. So what you want to understand about the Tariff Law, the Ford and Mccomber Tariff Law. It's a bill passed to protect domestic production from foreign competitors, because remember, a lot of cheap goods are coming from Europe at this time to help with the European economy. So there's a tariff that's put on the imported goods. It's rising from that of the Woodrow Wilson's Underwood tariff era. President Harding and Coolidge, true to their big business sympathies, were far more friendly to tariff increases than the reductions. In 6 years, they authorized 32 upward changes, including on their list vital commodities like dairy products, chemicals, and pig iron. During the same period, the White House ordered only 5 reductions. These included mill feed and such trifling items as bob white quail and paintbrush handles, phenol, and creslic acid. The high tariffs, course thus created by the Republican regime, set off a modest chain reaction. European producers felt the squeeze, for the American tariff walls prolonged their post-war chaos. An impoverished Europe needed to sell its manufactured goods to the United States, particularly if it helped to achieve economic recovery to pay its huge war debt to Washington. America needed to give foreign nations a chance to make profit from it, so they could buy its manufactured articles and repay debts. International trade, Americans were slow to learn, is a two-way street. In general, they cannot sell to others in quantity unless they bought from them in quantity or lent them more US dollars. So this is problematic because if Europe is rebuilding their economy, but yet you are taxing their goods, there is no way for them to recover from the economic disparity of World War One, right? Um, Erecting tariff walls was a game that two could play. The American example spurred European nations throughout the feverish 1920s to pile up high barrier themselves. These artificial obstacles were doubly bad. They not only hurt American made goods, but the products of European countries as well. The whole vicious circle further deepened into international economic distress, providing one more rung in the ladder by which Adolf Hitler scrambled to power. So, I mean, when you're looking at the struggle of the European economy during this time, America could take some responsibility for that. So, looking number 9, increased taxes on European goods. What impact did tariffs passed under the Harding Coolidge have upon the U.S.? Um, I mean, yes, it promoted domestic production. However, what you're getting is, Europe is going to fire back with barriers of their own, right? So, in some ways, it also hurt the United States economy. The stretch of scandal. Discuss the background and impact of the Teapot Dome scandal. The loose morality and get-rich-quickism of the Harding era manifested themselves particularly in a series of scandals. Early in 1923, Colonel Charles R. Forbes, one-time deserter from the Army, was caught with his hand in the till and resigned as head of the Veterans Bureau. An appointee of the gullible Harding, he and his accomplices looted the government to the tune of about $200 million, chiefly in connection with the building of veterans' hospitals. He was sentenced to 2 years in a federal penitentiary. Most shocking of all this was a Teapot Dome scandal, an affair that involved priceless naval oil reserves at the Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. In 1921, the slippery Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, induced his careless colleague, the Secretary of the Navy, to transfer these valuable properties to the Interior Department. Harding indiscreetly signed a secret order. Fall then quickly leased the lands to oilman Harry F. Sinclair and Edward L. Doney, but not until he had received a loan of $100,000 or a bribe from Doney, about 3 times that amount in all from Sinclair. The Teapot Dome, no tempest in Teapot, finally came to a whistling boil. Details of the crooked transaction gradually began to leak out in March 1923. 2 years later, after Harding took office, Fall, Sinclair, and Doney were indicted the next year, but the case dragged through the courts until 1929. Finally, Fall was found guilty of taking a bribe and was sentenced to 1 year in jail. By a curious quirk of justice, the two bribe givers were acquitted while the bribe taker was convicted. Although Sinclair served several months in jail for having shadowed jurors for refusing to testify before a Senate committee. The oily smudge from the Teapot Dome polluted the prestige of the Washington government. Right-thinking citizens wondered what was going on when public officials could sell out the nation's vital resources, especially those reserved for the U.S. Navy. The acquittal of Sinclair and Doney undermined faith in the courts, while giving further currency to the cynical sayings, you can't put $1 million in jail. And in America, everyone is assumed guilty until proven rich. So, a couple of scandals that you want to make sure you know. Of course, you're getting Charles R. Forbes, who is looting the Veterans Fund, right? That's very bad. But the Teapot Dome scandal, in short, it's a affair involving the lease of priceless naval oil reserves. So you're getting this land that's meant to be for a navy. It's being leased out to private companies, and you're getting individuals that are taking bribes for this, right? This is very bad in America. I mean, not only it's corrupt, right? But of course, when you're looking at the sentencing that exists for this, the sentencing that exists for this, it allows people to understand that those that are rich and that those that are wealthy, that they're able to get away with either being acquitted or sentencing that's not necessarily fair. The brutal fact is that Harvey was not a strong enough man. Oh, where were we? Still more scandals erupted. Persistent reports to the upper-handed doings of Attorney General Doherty prompted a Senate investigation in 1924 of the legal sale of pardons and liquor permits. Forced to resign, the accused official was tried in 1927, but was released after a jury twice failed to agree. During the trial, Daugherty hid behind the trousers of the now dead Harding by implying that the president probing might uncover crookedness in the White House. Harding was mercifully spared the full revelation of these iniquities, though his worst suspicions were aroused. While news of scandals were beginning to break, he embarked upon a speech-making tour across the country all the way to Alaska. On a return trip, he died in San Francisco on August 2 of pneumonia and thrombosis. His death may have been hastened by a broken heart resulting from disloyalty of designing friends. Mourning millions, not yet full aware of the graft in Washington, expressed genuine sorrow. So Harding dies, and one of the things that you understand about his administration is, of course, a lot of the corruption that existed. So discuss the background and the impact of the Teapot scandal, and kind of went over this. Of course, you're getting the leasing of naval land to private businesses. Through that, you're also getting a lot of bribes. The biggest outcome of this, I would say, is that people are understanding that the government is very corrupt, right? But also that they're sentencing, that if you're very rich and wealthy, the sentencing necessarily isn't fair, or people are not being acquitted, that there's a loss of faith in the courts. How did Coolidge earn the nicknames Silent Cal and Cautious Cal? News of Harding's death was sped to Vice President Coolidge, then visiting at his father's New England farmhouse. By the light of 2 kerosene lamps, the elder Coolidge, a justice of peace, and the old family Bible to administer the presidential oath to his son. This homespun setting was symbolic of Coolidge. Quiet, quite unlike Harding, the stern-faced Vermonter with his thin nose and tightly set lips embodied the New England virtues of honest morality, industry, and frugality. As a youth, his father reported, he seemed to get more sap out of a maple tree than did any other boys. Practicing a rigid economy in both money and words, Silent Cal came to be known in Washington conversational circles for his brilliant flashes of silence. His dour, serious visage prompted the acid observation that he had been on a wheat on a pickle. Coolidge seemed to be a crystallization of the commonplace. Painfully shy, he was blessed with only mediocre powers of leadership. He occasionally displayed a dry wit in private, but his speeches delivered in nasal New England twang were invariably boring. A staunch apostle of the status quo, he was no knight in armor riding forth to till their wrongs. True to Republican philosophy, he became the high priest of great God business. He believed the man who built a factory built a temple, and that the man who works there worships there. So a couple things. I mean, Coolidge, as the Kennedy, the author of our book, kind of describes him. He describes him as a true Republican, but also someone that's very quiet, very shy, not necessarily the most charismatic of individuals. Of course, he does favor big businesses. In fact, in that last quote, he's praising those that are able to start large factories and industrialization. The hands-off temperament of cautious Cal suited the times perfectly. His thrifty nature caused him to sympathize fully with Secretary of Treasury Mellon's efforts to reduce both taxes and debts. No foe of industrial bigness, he let big business have its head. Coolidge's luck held during his 5.5 prosperity-blessed years. Ever a profile in caution, Coolidge slowly gave the Harding regime a badly needed moral fumigation. The Teapot Dome had scalded the Republican Party badly, but so transparently honest was the Ministry Vermonter that the scandalous oil did not rub off on him. The public thought, at first, shocked by scandal, quickly simmered down, and an alarming tendency developed in certain quarters to excuse some of the wrongdoers on the grounds that they had gotten away with it. Some critics even condemned the government prosecutors for continuing to rock the boat. Americans' moral sensibility was evidently being dulled by prosperity. So Cautious Cal, the reason why he's called Cautious Cal is because he's still he's letting big business kind of do what they want. He's very cautious because of his hands-off temperament. He's very calm. He's cool about it. He's very relaxed, and he's not acting too much in terms of stopping the corruption from happening. I mean, he thinks it's a priority. However, he's very hands-off with it, right? And he's letting big businesses do what they want. Frustrated farmers. Sun-bronzed farmers were caught squarely in a boom or bust cycle in the post-war decade. While the fighting had raged, they had raked in money and hand over gnarled fist. By spring of 1920, the price of wheat had shot up to an incredible $3 a bushel. But peace brought an end to government-guaranteed high prices and to massive purchases by other nations as foreign production re-entered the stream of world commerce. So what they're saying is during World War I, farmers were thriving. But this is going to be a little bit different during the 1920s. Machines also threatened to plow the farmers under an avalanche of their own overabundant crops. The gasoline engine tractor was working a revolution on American farms. The steel mule was to cultivation and sowing what McCormick reaper was to harvesting. Blue-eyed farmers no longer had to plod after the horse-drawn plow with high-footed gait. They could sit erect on their chugging mechanized chariots and turn under harrow many acres in a single day. They could grow bigger crops in larger areas using fewer horses and hired hands. The wartime boom had encouraged them to bring vast new tracts under cultivation, especially in the wheat belt of the upper Midwest. But such improved efficiency had expanded agriculture creage helped to pile up more price dampening surpluses. A withering depression swept through agricultural districts in the 1920s when one farm in four sold for debt for taxes. As a plaintive song of the period ran, there's no use for talking any man's beat. What 5-cent cotton, 40-cent meat. Schemes abounded for bringing relief to the hard-pressed farmers. A bipartisan farm bloc from the agricultural states coalesced in Congress in 1921 succeeded in driving through helpful laws. Noteworthy was the Capper-Volstead Act, which exempted farmers marketing cooperatives from antitrust prosecution. The farmers' bloc favorite proposal was the McNary-Haugen bill, pushed energetically from 24 to 28. It sought to keep agricultural prices high by authorizing the government to buy surpluses and sell them abroad. Government losses were to be made by special tax on the farmers. Congress twice passed a bill, but frugal Coolidge twice vetoed it. Farm prices stayed down, and farmers' political temperatures stayed high, fevering a pitch in the election of 1924. So, all in all, what you want to understand about this section is that farmers aren't doing well, although just because of the introduction of gas, you're getting tractors that are replacing the plow and the horse, which is great. I mean, you're getting tons more production. However, when you're getting a surplus of goods, and looking at the laws of supply and demand, when you have too much of a good, the problem is that prices are going to go low, right? At the same time, you're getting you're getting low prices, but the farmers are also overproducing surpluses due to the increase of technology. the farmers are buying all of these tractors, right? So they're increasing their debt. But if the farm or the crops aren't selling well, you're going to be in. You can't pay those debts off, right? So, what concerns did the farmers have in post World War One? I mean, obviously, what you're looking at here is surpluses as well as debt, low prices, high debt, too many crops as a result, too much crop production as a result of the tractor and yeah, and innovations, and they need to pay for that, right? What was the McNary-Hagen bill? So let's go back to that. When you're looking at the McNary-Hagen bill, sorry, computer froze. The McNary-Hagen bill, a farm relief bill that was championed through 1920s, aimed to keep agricultural prices high. So you're getting a government that's buying the surpluses and selling them abroad, right? Um, so that's what this bill was looking to do, right? However, you understand that Congress twice passed the bill, but President Coolidge would veto it in 1927 and 1928. So, I mean, it never passed. So therefore, farmers are continuing to struggle. Three-way race for the White House in 1924. A three-way race for the White House in 1924. Self-satisfied Republicans chanting "Keep Cool" and "Keep Coolidge" nominate Silent Cal for the presidency at a convention in Cleveland in the summer of 1924. Squabbling Democrats had more difficulty choosing candidate when they met in New York's sweltering Madison Square Garden, reflecting many of the cultural tensions of the decade. The party was hopefully split between wets and dries, urbanites and farmers, fundamentalists and modernists, northern liberals and southern stad patterns, immigrants and old stock Americans. In one symptomatic spasm of discord, the conventioners failed by just one vote to pass a resolution condemning the KKK. Deadlocked for an unprecedented 102 ballots, the convention last turned wearily, sweatily, and unenthusiastically to John W. Davis, a wealthy corporation lawyer connected with the Wall Street banking of J.P. Morgan and Company. The polished nominee was no less conservative than the cautious Calvin Coolidge. The field was now wide open for a liberal candidate, the white pampered Senator Robert Fighting Bob La Follette from Wisconsin, perennial aspirant to the presidency and now 69 years of age, sprang forward to lead a new progressive party. He gained the endorsement of the American Federation of Labor and enjoyed the support of the shrinking Socialist Party, but his major constituency was made up of price-pinched farmers. La Follette's new progressive party, wielding only presidential ticket with no candidates for local office, was a head without a body. It proved only the shadow of the robust progressive coalition of pre-war days. Its platform called for government ownership of railroads, relief for farmers, lashed out at monopoly and anti-labor injunctions, and urged a constitutional amendment to limit the Supreme Court's power to invalidate laws passed by Congress. So we're getting John W. Davis, who's another conservative. You are also getting, of course, Calvin Coolidge, and then you're getting Fighting Bob La Follette from Wisconsin. Remember, I mean, he was from Madison, Wisconsin. He was served as a city manager, and he's a progressive. He's looking to push back some more legislation to benefit farmers, but also to ensure that labor workers are getting more rights that were often shunned down on during the Harding administration. La Follette turned in a respectable showing, polling nearly 5 million votes, but cautious Cal and the oil-smeared Republicans slipped easily back into office, overwhelming Davis 15 million to 8 million. The electoral count stood at 382 for Coolidge, 136 for Davis, and 13 for La Follette, all from his home state of Wisconsin. In the so-called conscience of the chaos of the 1920s, La Follette injected a badly needed liberal tonic into a decade drugged on prosperity. But times were too good for too many people for his reform message to carry the day. And this kind of shows that. So, question is, what were the three-way race in the 1920s? What were the issues in the 1924 election? We kind of talked about this already. Of course, farmers were also dealing with issues. The main issues that you're looking at are agricultural prices, prohibition, as well as whether or not looking at religion in schools, fundamentalist versus modernist. Those were all issues that were being brought up during this time. Um, of course, Calvin Coolidge ends up winning. The economy as a whole is doing well. Big business is doing well. And that's part of the reason why he would win. But of course, a lot of the farmers are not happy about this. Foreign policy flounderings. What financial issues existed for America? International debt, allied war debt, and debt nation versus creditor nation. Isolation continued to reign in the Coolidge era. Despite presidential proddings, the Senate proved unwilling to allow America to adhere to the World Court. The judicial arm of the still suspect League of Nations, Coolidge only half-heartedly and unsuccessfully pursued naval disarmament after the loudly trumpeted agreements worked out at the Washington Conference in 1922. A glaring exception to the United States' inward-looking indifference to the outside world was armed interventionism in the Caribbean and Central America. American troops were withdrawn after an 8-year stay from the Dominican Republic, but they remained in Haiti from 14 to 34. President Coolidge in 1925 briefly removed American bayonets from the troubled Nicaragua, where they had glinted intermittently since 1909, but in 1926 he sent them back, 5,000 strong, and they stayed there until 1933. American oil companies clamored for a military expedition in Mexico in 1926 when the Mexican government began to assert its sovereignty over oil resources. Coolidge kept cool and diffused the Mexican crisis with some diplomatic negotiation, but his mailed, uh, but his mailed fist tactics elsewhere bred sore sentiments south of the Rio Grande, where angry critics loudly assailed Yankee imperialism. Overshadowing all the foreign problems in 1920 was a knotty issue of international debt. Complicated tangle of private loans, Allied war debts, and the German reparation payments. Almost overnight, World War I had reversed the international financial position of the United States. In 1914, America had been a debtor nation to the sum of $4 billion. By 1922, it became a creditor nation to the sum of $16 billion. The almighty dollar rivaled the pound and sterling as the financial giant of the world. American investors loaned some 10 billion to foreigners in 1920s, um, though even this huge river of money could not fully refloat the war-shelled world economy. Americans bewitched by lucrative investment opportunities in the domestic economy did not lend nearly so large a fraction of their national income overseas as had British in the pre-war period. The key knot in the debt tangle was that 10 billion in the U.S. Treasury had been loaned to the Allies during and immediately after war. Uncle Sam had their IOUs and he wanted them to be paid. The Allies, in turn, protested that the demand for payment was grossly unfair. The French and Britain pointed out, with much justice, that they held up a wall of flesh and bone against a common foe until America, the unready, had finally entered the fray. America, they argued, should write off its loan as war cost, just as the Allies had been tragically forced to write off their lives of millions of young men. The debtors also complained that the real effect of their borrowed dollars had been to fuel in the boom of the already wartime economy in America, which nearly all their purchases had been made. And the final straw, protested the Europeans, was that America's post-war tariff laws made it impossible for them to sell their goods to earn dollars to pay off their debts. So a couple things that you want to make sure that you understand here. Foreign policy flounderings. Of course, we discussed this. This is looking at more of foreign intervention in Latin America. Of course, we're going to withdraw our troops from the Dominican Republic in 1924, and as well as, however, we won't withdraw troops from Haiti until 1930s. One issue that you want to keep in mind is just this conflict with Mexico during this time. American oil companies, they're concerned specifically because the Mexican government is starting to assert some of the control over them, right? And Mexico is not happy about this because they claim that, of course, when Coolidge steps in, this is a perfect example of Yankee imperialism, right? Trading of resources. A couple things that you also want to make sure that you understand is that, and I think this image kind of just sums this up best, is that during the wartime, the Allies provided a lot of, they allowed they allowed the Allies, or the United States allowed the Allies, of course, to borrow money, right? Of course, Uncle Sam wants to be paid back, but this just is not able to happen because, number one, you have these tariffs that are up. And as a result of these tariffs against Europe being up, Europeans feel as if they can't make money, which allow them to pay back these debts, right? Also, what a lot of the odds are saying, let's just wipe out the debt, forget about it. Um, they're saying that as a result of defeating Germany, it was mostly France and Great Britain, so that should be enough to cover the debt. So let's discuss this. The first question: what financial issues existed for America in the following areas? Okay. I want to start off with debtor nation versus creditor nation. One thing that's important to understand is prior to the war, America had been a debtor nation. That means that we owed a sum of about $4 million. However, now what ends up happening is by 1922, end of the war, we are a creditor nation. Is that we need that money back, right? We need that money back. That our economy is actually up. However, Europe, Great Britain, France, they owe us money, right? So that's one of the things that you want to make sure you understand. The second part, what financial issues existed for America in the following areas? You're also looking at international debt. And this is one thing that we're looking at here. This is the way that the international debt merry-go-round goes, right? The U.S. investors, you're getting Wall Street, right? Bankers, they're lending money to Great Britain, right? They're lending money, or sorry, to Germany. However, remember, during World War One, Germany owes reparations. They're responsible for funding the war completely. They are giving this money, right, back to Great Britain and France. However, Great Britain and France, um, they owe the United States money for just the resources that were borrowed during war. Now, they're paying this back to the United States. They're paying back to the government. So in actuality, what you end up getting here is you're getting U.S. investors that are kind of just funding this debt. And the United States isn't necessarily the most happy with this. Yeah? Allied war debt, the issue is Great Britain and France, they're claiming they can't pay it because of tariffs. The United States has instilled so many tariffs on them that their economy can't grow, right? And they're asking for them just to cancel it. Unraveling the debt knot. America's tight-fisted insistence on getting its money back helped to harden the hearts of the Allies against conquered Germany. The French and British demanded that the Germans make enormous reparation payments, totaling some $32 billion, as a result of compensation for war-inflicted damages. The Allies hoped to settle their debts to the United States with the money received from Germany. The French, seeking to extort lagging reparation payments, sent troops into Germany's industrialized Ruhr Valley in 1923. Berlin responded by permitting its currency to inflate astronomically. At one point in October 1923, a loaf of bread cost 480 million marks, or about 120 million in pre-inflation money. German society teetered on the brink of mad anarchy, and the whole international house of financial cards threatened to flutter down in colossal chaos. So Great Britain and France, of course, they want to pay the debt back, and they're doing this through the reparation payments of Germany. Germany is responsible for paying the war. The French actually go into the Ruhr Valley, which it's an abundance of resources, and they demand that they take those resources from the Ruhr Valley. Germany experiences hyperinflation, and that's why Hitler is able to come to power. Right? So much economic instability. They were looking for that sense of stability to exist. Sensible statements now urge the war debts and reparations alike be drastically scaled down or even canceled outright. But to Americans, such proposals smacked of welshing on a debt. We went across what they won't come across, cried a prominent politician. Scrooge, like Coolidge, turned aside suggestions of debt cancellation with a typically terse question. They hired the money, didn't they? The Washington administration proved especially unrealistic in its dogged insistence that there was no connection between debts and reparations. Reality finally dawned in Dawes' Plan of 1924, negotiated largely by Charles Dawes, about to be nominated as Coolidge's running mate. It rescheduled German reparation payments and opened the way for further American private loans to Germany. The whole financial cycle now became still more complicated. As U.S. bankers loaned money to Germany, Germany paid reparations to France and Great Britain, and the former Allies paid war debts to the United States. Clearly, the source of the monetary merry-go-round was the flowing well of American credit. When that well dried up after a great crash in 1929, the jungle of international finance quickly turned into a desert. President Herbert Hoover declared a 1-year debt moratorium in 1931, before all the debtors had defaulted except honest little Finland, which struggled along making payments until the last debt was discharged in 1976. The United States never did get its money, but harvested a bumper crop of ill will. Irate French crowds on occasion attacked American tourists, and throughout Europe, Uncle Sam was caricatured as Uncle Shylock, greedily whetting his knife on the last pound of Allied flesh. The bad taste left in American mouths by the whole sorry episode contributed to powerful storm cellar neutrality legislation passed by Congress in the 1930s. So let's go through here. What was the Dawes plans and what impact did this have on the financial cycle? So let's go back to this Dawes plan. The Dawes plan, very important to understand. It was an arrangement negotiated in 1924 to reschedule German reparation payments, stabilize the German currency, and opened a way for further American private loans to Germany. So it's basically rescheduling it's rescheduling the payments. It's lessening the payments that Germans had to pay. It's in some ways trying to provide some stability for them, right? And what this also allows is it's allowing the banks, United States banks, to loan this money to Germany, right? Of course, when you're loaning money, there's always interest that exists, right? But in turn, I mean, remember this money is kind of going back to the Allies to pay these reparations, which means that the government is getting this money back, right? The federal government is. I mean, the Allies are not happy about this. They're not happy with the fact the United States continues with their tariffs. And they're not also happy with the fact that, they're not happy because it's crippling their economy, right? They're not happy with the fact as well as that the war debt still has to be paid. Okay? This becomes the Dawes plan basically does not exist when the Great Depression happens because America can no longer loan money because the banks are not doing well. The triumph of Hoover. Poker-faced Calvin Coolidge, the tight-lipped Sphinx of the Potomac, bowed out of the 1928 presidential race when he announced, "I do not choose to run." His logical successor was Super Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, unpopular with the political bosses, but the much-admired darling of the masses who asked, "Who but Hoover?" He was nominated on a platform that clucked contentedly over both prosperity and prohibition. Still squabbling Democrats nominated Alfred E. Smith, four-time governor of New York and one of the most colorful personalities in American politics. He was wisecracking, gland-handling liberal who suffered from several fatal political handicaps. Alcohol Smith was soakingly and drippingly wet at a time when the country was still devoted to the noble experiment of prohibition. So that's one thing you want to understand. There's a difference between both. Smith, alcohol, Hoover is prohibition. To a nation that he had recently moved to the city, native New Yorker Smith seemed too abrasively urban. He was a Roman Catholic in an overwhelmingly Protestant and unfortunately prejudiced land. Many dry rural fundamentalist Democrats gagged on his candidacy, and they saddled the wet Smith with a dry running mate and a dry platform. Jauntily sporting a brown derby and a big cigar, Smith, the happy warrior, tried to carry alcohol on one shoulder and water on the other, but his effort was doomed from the start. Of course, you're getting Hoover, Protestant. You're also getting Smith, Catholic. Radio figured prominently in this campaign for the first time, and it helped Hoover more than Smith. The New Worker had a personal sparkle, but he could not project it through radio, which in the Lower East Side swang he pronounced radio, grating over the ears of many listeners. Iowa-born Hoover, with his double-breasted dignity, came on the microphone better than he went in, decrying un-American socialism and preaching rugged individualism. He sounded both brutish and statesmanlike. Other differences that you want to get, of course, Hoover is more individualism, while Alfred Smith is more, he's definitely more progressive. Chubby-faced, ruddy-complexioned Herbert Hoover with his painfully high starch collar was living an example of the American success story, an intriguing mixture of two centuries. As a poor orphan boy who had worked his way through Stanford University, he'd absorbed the 19th century copybook maxims of industry, thrift, and self reliance. As a fabulously successful mining engineer and a brilliant businessman, he had honed to a high degree the efficiency doctrines of the progressive era. Small town boy from Iowa and Oregon, he traveled and worked abroad extensively, long years of self imposed exile, and deepened his determination, abundantly supported by national tradition to avoid foreign entanglements. His experiences abroad had further strengthened his faith in American individualism, free enterprise, and small government. So, you're looking at it. He's a lot different. I mean, when you're looking at Smith, he's more urban. Of course, Hoover, he's more rural, right? His unshaken dignity and Quaker restraint. Um, Hoover was a far cry from the typical backslapping politician. Though a citizen of the world and later with international honors, he was quite shy, standoffish, and stiff. Personally colorless in public, he had been accustomed during much of his life to giving orders to subordinates and not to soliciting votes. Never before elected to public office, he was thin skinned in the face of criticism, and he not adapt readily to the necessity and give and take of political accommodation. His political power lay in his integrity, his humanitarianism, and his passion for assembling the facts. His efficiency, his talent in administration, his ability to inspire loyalty and close associates. They called him the chief. As benefited America's newly mechanized civilization, Hoover was the ideal business person's candidate, a self made millionaire. He recoiled from everything suggesting socialism, paternalism, or planned economy. Yet, Secretary of Commerce, he had exhibited some progressive instincts. He endorsed labor unions and supported federal regulation of the new radio broadcasting industry. He even flirted for the time with the idea of the government owned radio, similar to the BBC. Um, as bands blared Smith's theme song, The Sidewalks of New York, the campaign sank into the sewers beneath the sidewalks. Despite the best efforts of Hoover and Smith, below the belt tactics were employed to a disgusting degree by lower level campaigners. Religious bigotry raised its hideous head over Smith's Catholicism. An irresponsible, whimpering campaign claimed that a vote for Smith is a vote for the Pope, and that a White House under Smith would become a branch of the Vatican, complete with Romanism, and ruin. Hoover's attempts to quash such rumors were in vain. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of differences between these two. Um, Hoover, you're looking at more business, more laissez-faire, uh, and of course, he's a Protestant. While you're getting um, the opposite of of Alfred Smith, who's prohibition, more urban, right? The proverbially solid South, 100% American and stronghold Protestant Ku Klux Klan shied away from the city's slicker Al Smith. It might have accepted a Catholic or a Wet or descendant of Irish grandparents or an urbanite, but the conception of Catholicism, Wetism, foreignism, and liberalism brewed in the sidewalks of New York was too bitter to those in the southern stomachs. Smith's theme song was constant and rasping remind, and upbringing had not been convincingly American. Hoover triumphed in a landslide. He bagged 21.3 million votes to 15 million for his embittered opponent, while rolling up an account of the Electoral College from 444 to 87. A huge Republican majority was returned to the House of Representatives. 10,000s of dry Southern Democrats, Hoovercrats, rebelled against Al Smith, and Hoover proved to be the first Republican candidate in 52 years, except for Harding's Tennessee victory in 1920, to carry a state that had seceded. He swept 5 states of the former Confederacy as well as the border states. Why was the election of 1928 a landslide for Hoover? You're looking at a lot of Southerners just cannot support Smith, regardless of their political party. They were against his Catholic views. They were also against his views to abolish prohibition. And anyone that lived in a rural, I mean, they just felt like they could not connect with someone that was more like the urban Alfred Smith. President Hoover's first moves. Prosperity in the late 1920s smiled broadly as the Hoover's years began. Soaring stocks in the bull market continued to defy the laws of financial gravitation. But two immense groups of citizens were not getting their share of the riches from the national cornucopia: the organized wage earners and the disorganized farmers. So you're looking at wage earners as well as farmers that are not happy under Hoover's admin. Hoover's administration, in line with his philosophy of promoting self-help, responded to the outcry of wounded farmers with the legislative aspirin. The Agricultural Marketing Act, passed by Congress in 1929, was designed to help farmers help themselves, largely through producers' cooperatives. It set up a federal farm board with a revolving fund of $500 million at its disposal. Money was lent generously to farm organizations seeking to buy, sell, and store agricultural supplies. So he does set up the AMA, the Agricultural Marketing Act. What this is, it's a board that's basically provided to help farmers. However, one thing that you want to understand is as the Depression worsened in 1930, the board tried to bolster falling prices by buying up surpluses, but it was unable to cope with the flood of farm produce to market. So this would eventually fail during the Great Depression. So it's lending money out to farmers as well as helping them buy and store agricultural surpluses. Remember, because of the innovation, there's agricultural surplus, which is good, but there's just no sales for it. In 1930, the Farm Board itself created the Grain Stabilization Corporation and the Cotton Stabilization Corporation. The prime goal was to bolster sagging prices by buying up surpluses. But these two agencies were soon suffocated by an avalanche of farm produce as wheat dropped to 57 cents a bushel and cotton to 5 cents a pound. So prices for these goods are continuing to just drop, and farmers aren't making profit. Farmers had meanwhile clutched at the tariff as a possible straw to help their heads above the waters of financial ruin. During the recent presidential campaign, Hoover, an amateur in politics, had been stampeded in political unwise pledge. He had promised to call into Congress a special session to consider agricultural relief and specifically to bring about limited changes in the tariff. These hope-giving assurances no doubt won many votes for Hoover in the Midwestern Farm Belt. So the Midwest was hoping to lower that tariff that Hoover had, right? A lot of the farmers were hoping that. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930 followed the well-worn pattern of Washington horse trading. It started out in the House as a fairly responsible or reasonable protective measure designed to assist the farmers, but by the time the high-pressure lobbyists had pushed it through the Senate, it acquired about 1,000 amendments. It thus turned out to be the highest protective tariff in the nation's peacetime history. The average duty on non-free goods was raised from 38% and was established by the Ford and Mccomber Tariff in 1922 to nearly 60%. To angered foreigners, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff was a blow below the trade belt. It seemed like a declaration of economic warfare on the entire outside world. It reversed a promising worldwide trend to reasonable tariffs and widened the yawning trade gaps. It plunged both America and other nations deeper into terrible depression that had already begun. It increased international financial chaos and forced the United States further into the bog of economic isolationism. And economic isolation, both at home and abroad, was pinned directly into the hands of hate-filled German demagogue Adolf Hitler. So it's very important to understand the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. It's raising tariffs, right? And during this time of depression as well as post-wartime, it's causing more of this sense of individualism amongst every nation. So what was the Agricultural Marketing Act, and how is it reflective of President Hoover's philosophy? So it's lending resources to farmers to better themselves, to better their production, right? It's not actually just doing it for them, right? But it's setting up this agency that's allowing to give support. However, the farmers still need that independent responsibility of their own to thrive and do well. So what was the Hawley-Smoot Tariff from 1930? And one thing I want to make sure is that the farmers wanted limited changes with the tariffs, right? However, what this does is it increases the tariff significantly, and foreigners are very angry about this because, of course, their goods are not allowed to be, or it's less sales for them in the United States. So European goods are going to be taxed. Europe's not going to make any finances off this, or they're not going to make as much profit, which increases tension. The Great Crash ends the golden 20s. When Hoover confidently took the presidential oath on March 4, 1929, there were few black clouds on the economic horizon. The long boom seemed endless, with the painful exception of the debt blanketed Farm Belt. America's productive colossus, stimulated by the automobile, radio, movies, and other new industries, were roaring along at a dizzy speed that suggested a permanent plateau of prosperity. Few people sensed that it might be smother its own fires by pouring out too much. The speculative bubble was actually near the bursting point. Prices on the stock exchange continued to spiral upward and create a fool's paradise of paper profits, despite Hoover's early but fruitless efforts to curb speculation through the Federal Reserve Board. A few prophets of disaster were bold enough to sound warnings, but were drowned by the mad chatter of the ticker tape machine. So it seems as if the economy is doing well. You're getting things such as the radio, automobile, and other industries that were roaring along, right? A catastrophic crash came in October 1929. It was partially triggered by the British, who raised their interest rates in an effort to bring back capital lured abroad by American investments. Foreign investors and wary domestic speculators began to dump their insecurities, and an orgy of selling followed. Tension built up to the panicky Black Tuesday on October 29, when 16 million shares of stocks were sold in a save who may scramble. Wall Street became a wailing gloom, and doom replaced boom, and suicides increased alarmingly. A sick joke at the time had hotel room clerks ask registrants for sleeping or jumping. So, a couple things that we want to make sure we understand. When we're getting Great Britain, remember, Great Britain's not doing as well financially. We also have very high tariffs on their goods. So what Great Britain starts to do is they raise their interest rates in efforts to bring back capital lured by the American investments, right? So at this time, you are getting this individualism in the economy, right? America's watching out for America. Europe is watching out for Europe. So Great Britain responds to that. So as a result, it says here, foreign investors and where domestic speculators begin to dump their insecurities. So because you're getting all these people that have invested in stocks, what they want to do is they feel insecure. So you're getting people that are selling their stocks. They want their money back. They want their money. I mean, money is liquid. Like if you have your money, you could go ahead and buy goods immediately. If your money's invested in stocks, you can't, right? So we get what we call Black Tuesday, this dark, panicky day on October when over 16 million stocks were sold in the stock market. People are selling their stocks. They want their money back, but they can't get their money back. So this is going to trigger what we call the Great Depression. Losses, even in blue chip securities, were unbelievable. By the end of 1929, 2 months after initial crash, stockholders had lost $40 billion in paper values and more than the total cost of World War I in shares. The stock market collapse heralded a business depression at home and abroad that was the most prolonged and prostrating in American world experience. No other industrial nation suffered a severe setback. By the end of 1930, more than 4 million workers in the United States were jobless. 2 years later, the figure had about tripled. Hungry and despairing workers pounded pavements in search of non-existent jobs, where employees were not discharged. Wages and salaries were often slashed. Right? A current jingle ran. Mellon pulled a whistle, Hoover rang the bell, Wall Street gave the signal, and the country went to hell. The misery and gloom were incalculable. As forests of dead chimneys stood stark against the sky, over 5,000 banks collapsed in the first 3 years of the Depression, carrying down with them life savings, tens of thousands of ordinary citizens. Countless thousands of honest, hardworking people lost their homes and farms to the foreclosures' hammers. Bread lines formed, soup kitchens dispensed, food and apple sellers stood shivering on the street corners, trying to peddle their ways for 5 cents. Families felt so stressed as jobless fathers nursed their guilt and shame to not being able to provide for their households. Breadless breadwinners often blamed themselves for their plight, despite abundant evidence of the economic system, not individual initiative, had broken down. Mothers, meanwhile, nursed fewer babies as hard times reached even into the nation's bedrooms, precipitating a decade of long drought of births. As cash registers gathered, cobwebs of song, "My God, how the money rolls in," was replaced, "Brother, can you spare a dime?" So, a couple things that we want to understand here, just in short, is so remember, if people want to get their stocks and they're trying to sell their stocks, get their money, they can't do so, right? One of the reasons is these banks are not insured, by the government. So if people want to get out their money from the banks and they're getting these trying to get their money out, eventually what ends up happening is the banks no longer exist, right? Um, as a result of this, businesses start to fail, right? If businesses, for example, if businesses no longer, if people are no longer buying goods because they don't have access to their money in the banks, right? Uh, they can't buy goods. If people can't buy goods, that means businesses are no longer thriving and doing well, which means they're closing down and they're laying off people, right? So all in all, what you understand is as a result of the stock market crashing, um, people try to sell their stocks. They can't do so. People then try to take their money out of the banks. They can't do that as well. um, and then all in all, it's leading to the Great Depression. Yep. And I just discussed those major issues just now. Rugged times for rugged individualists. Hoover exalted a reputation as a wonder worker, an efficiency engineer crashed about us dismally as the stock market. He doubly would have shown in prosperity drenched Coolidge years, when he had foreseen the abolition of poverty in poorhouses. But damning the Great Depression proved to be a task beyond his engineering talents. The perplexed president was impaled on the horns of a cruel dilemma. As deservingly a famed humanitarian, he was profoundly distressed by the widespread misery about him. Yet, as a rugged individualist, deeply rooted in an earlier era of free enterprise, he shrank from the heresy of government handouts, convinced that industry, thrift, and self-reliance were the virtues that made America great. President Hoover feared that the government doling out doles would weaken, perhaps destroy that national fiber. So remember, he's an individualist. He's a self-made millionaire. So what Hoover he doesn't want to give handouts out, even though it's a Great Depression. He's reluctant to do so. As the Depression nightmare steadily worsened, relief by local government agencies broke down. Hoover was finally forced to turn reluctantly from his doctrine of log cabin individualism and accept the proposition that the welfare of the people in a nationwide catastrophe is a concern of the national government. The president at last worked out a compromise between the old Hanson philosophy and the soul destroying directed dole then being used in England. He would assist the hard pressed railroads, banks, and rural credit corporations in hope that if financial health were restored, the top of the economic pyramid, unemployment would be relieved at the bottom of a trickle down basis. So Hoover is trying to provide some economic relief, of course, to railroads, banks, and rural credit corporations to help restore the economy. Partisan critics sneered at the great humanitarian who had fed the faraway Belgians, but would not use federal funds to feed needy Americans. So he's helping the companies, but he's not actually feeding the Americans themselves that are unemployed and starving. Hostile commentators remarked that he was willing to lend government money to big bankers who allegedly had plunged the country into the mess. He would likewise lend the money to agricultural organizations to feed pigs but not people. Pigs, the cynics of the time noted, had no character to undermine. Much of his criticism was unfair. Although continued suffering seemed to mock the effectiveness of Hoover's measures, his efforts probably prevented a more serious collapse than did occur. And his expenditures for relief, revolutionary for that day, paved the path for enormous federal outlays of his New Deal successor, Franklin Roosevelt. Hoover proved that the old strap bullying techniques would no longer work in a crisis of his magnitude, especially when people lacked the boots. So he's being highly criticized because he's trying to use his aid to stimulate business, right? Um, However, he's not directly helping the people, right? And it would be Franklin Roosevelt that would. But he is kind of setting the foundations for those New Deal programs. Second. So I believe I did skip a question. I apologize, but let me go through this. So how did Hoover's rugged individual work against him? Well, it worked against him specifically because he he felt as if the government shouldn't be given handouts, that people should be willing to or should be capable of helping themselves. But unfortunately, this is too much of a crisis when people don't have the means to help themselves. So he's losing a lot of support. So his trickle down idea was to kind of help the big businesses. If you're helping the big businesses, the bankers, the ones that are supplying the jobs, that's going to help the economy kind of stabilize, which in turn is going to help the smaller worker, right? But of course, this doesn't necessarily work, right? That trickle-down idea. And I'm going to get back to that. I actually skipped it. Whoops, sorry. But let's go back to hooked on the horn of plenty. What caused the Great Depression? One basic explanation is overproduction by both farm and factory. Ironically, the Depression of 1930 was one of abundance, not want. It was a great glut, the plague of plenty. The nation's ability to produce goods had outrun its capacity to consume and pay for them. Too much money was going to the hands of few wealthy people, who in turn invested in factories and other agencies of production. Not enough was going into salaries and wages, where revitalizing purchase power would be quickly felt. So remember, during the time of Harding, during the time of Coolidge, big businesses were thriving. We're getting overproduction that's going on, right? So as factories as well as farms are overproducing, I think that they were a little bit of overconfident. Other maladies were at work: overexpansion of credit through installment plan, buying, overstimulation production. Paying, so-called easy terms, caused many consumers to dive in beyond their debt. Normal technological unemployment resulting from the new labor-saving machines also added to the burden to abnormal unemployment of the threadbare 30s. So remember, this is the Roaring 20s was a time of innovation as well, right? And as people are buying things on credit, eventually what's going to happen is they're not going to be able to make those payments. The already bleak picture was further darkened by economic anemia abroad. Britain and the continent had never fully recovered from World War I. Depression in America was given further downward by a push-chain reaction financial collapse in Europe. Following the failure in 1931, a prominent Vienna banking house, a drying up of international trade, moreover, had hastened by the short-sighted Hawley-Smoot tariff by 1930. European uncertainties over reparations, war debts, and defaults on loans owed to America caused tensions that reacted unfavorably on the United States. Many of these conditions had been created or worsened by Uncle Sam's own narrowed vision policies, but it was now too late to unscramble the omelet. So you're getting a lot of. So all in all, let me just go through this. You're getting going back here, big businesses, right, large corporations that are overproducing, right. But however, you're getting stagnant wages, so people can't necessarily buy products, right? And also, you're getting stagnant wages for the worker, but people are buying things on credit, right? They don't have the money to pay for these things, but they're doing so in installments, but they're also increasing their debt. And we're also getting the international situation. We're getting the tariff, the high tariff on European goods. And you're also getting reparation payments that had to be paid. You're getting the war debt that's being paid. So there's a lot of international instability that exists. As if man-made disasters were not enough, a terrible drought scorched the Mississippi Valley in 1930. Thousands of farms were sold at auctions for taxes, though in some cases, kind neighbors would intimidate prospective buyers, bid 1 cent, and return the prosperity to its original owner. Farm tenancy rentals. Species of peonage was spreading at an alarming rate for both blacks and whites. So you're also getting a drought that's happening. By 1930, the Depression had become a national calamity. Though no fault of their own, a host of industrious citizens had lost everything. They wanted to work, but there was no work. The insidious effect of all the day's despair of the nation's spirit was incalculable and long-lasting. America's uniqueness no longer seemed so unique, or its manifest destiny so manifest. There, too, the people had grasped with storms, trees, and stones, and other physical obstacles. But the Depression was baffling wraiths so they could not grasp. Initiative and self-respect were stifled as panhandlers begged for food or charity suit. In extreme cases, ragged individuals slept under Hoover blankets, fought under the content of garbage cans, or the crooked filings of oil drums in paper shanty towns, simply named Hoovervilles, right? So people are now homeless and living with these towns are called Hoovervilles because they're blaming this on Hoover. So explain why overproduction caused the Great Depression. I kind of talked about this already. You're getting big companies that are paying for overproduction, but wages aren't increasing as a result of this. Wages aren't increasing, right? People can't buy these goods, and if they are buying these goods, they're buying it specifically on credits. Hoover battles the Great Depression. President Hoover, in his line with trickle-down philosophy, at last recommended that Congress vote immense sums for the use of public works. Though at heart an anti-spender, he secured from Congress appropriations totaling $2.25 billion for such projects. Most imposing of these public enterprises was a gigantic Hoover Dam on Colorado River, voted by Congress in the days of Coolidge. It began in 1930 under Hoover and completed in 1936 under Roosevelt. It succeeded in creating a huge man-made lake for purposes of food, controlling, and electric power. So I'm getting this trickle-down philosophy. Of course, he doesn't want to give money directly to people, but what he would like to do is create jobs and projects that can hopefully employ people. One of these is, of course, the Hoover Dam, right? But Hoover certainly fought on all schemes that he regarded as socialist. Suspicious among them was the Muscle Shoals Bill, designed to dam the Tennessee River and ultimately embraced by Franklin Roosevelt's Tennessee Valley Authority. Hoover emphatically vetoed this measure, primarily because he opposed the government selling electricity in competition with its own citizens' private companies. Early 1932, Congress responded to Hoover's belated appeal and established the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. With initial working capital of $500 million, this agency became a government lending bank. It was designed to provide indirect relief by assisting insurance companies, banks, agricultural organizations, and railroads, and even hard-pressed state and local governments. But to preserve individual character, there would be no loans to individuals from this billion-dollar soup kitchen. So the RFC is meant to, once again, give loans to organizations and banks, but not directly to people. Pump priming loans by the RFC were no doubt widespread benefit. The organization was established many months too late for maximum usefulness. Projects that it supported were largely self-liquidating, and the government, as a banker, actually profited to the tune of millions of dollars. Giant corporations so obviously benefited from assistance that the RFC was dubbed, rather, the millionaire's dole. The irony is that the thrifty individual Hoover had sponsored a project, though with initial reluctance, it actually had a strong New Dealish flavor. So through the RFC, you're getting large corporations and banks that are thriving, right? That are benefiting from this. And the hope is that they would use that income to create jobs and stimulate the economy. Hoover's administration also provided some indirect benefits for labor. After storming debate, Congress passed the Norris-LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act, and Hoover signed it. The measure outlawed yellow dog anti-union contracts and forbade the federal governments to use injunctions to restrain strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing. So it allowed labor unions to exist and also go on strike. The truth is that Hoover, despite criticism of his hard list, did inaugurate a significant new policy. In previous panics, the masses had been forced to sweat it out. Slow, though, Hoover was to abandon his 19th century basis. By the end of his term, he had started down the road towards government assistance for needy citizens, a road that FDR would take so much further. So you want to understand is, although Hoover was not providing direct assistance to individuals, he did set the foundation for the New Deal. Hoover's woes were increased by a hostile Congress. At critical times during his first 2 years, the Republican majority proved uncooperative. Friction worsened during his last 2 years. Oppression cursed the electorate, rebelling the congressional elections of 1930. So reduced the Republican majority that Democrats controlled the House. Insurgent Republicans could and did combine with opposite Democrats to harass Hoover. Some of the president's troubles were deliberately manufactured by Congress, which in words played politics with human misery.